dig. Just like the grave diggers. Always trying to get beneath the surface. The same is true in a different way in Julius Caesar. John, will you go ahead, please?
Thanks for tuning in to the first look into my retrospective series of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Today, we focus on the origins of this wonderfully inconsistent franchise and pick apart the classic, A Nightmare on Elm Street.
The grave stood tenantless, and the sheeted dead did squeak and gibber in the Roman streets.
Yeah. It's gonna be alright. Nobody's gonna hurt. Just tell us what you want, alright?
Nancy.
Yourself, fucker! You are all my children now.
The birth and legacy of one of the most iconic and loved movie icons of all time start here, in Wes Craven's low-budget, appropriately named A Nightmare on Elm Street. Director Craven was inspired by newspaper articles in the LA Times about a series of unexplained deaths of Asian men who would suddenly die in their sleep. Wes Craven took most inspiration from a specific case in which a young man was too terrified to sleep, too afraid to face his nightmares. He would spit out sleeping pills he was given by his parents, and even went as far as to hiding a coffee machine in his room. When the man eventually fell asleep, his family were jolted from their beds by screaming, and before they got to the man, he had already died in his sleep. Armed with this nightmare fuel and memories of a man that terrified Craven as a child, Wes wrote a movie about a scarred man who would stalk teenagers into their dreams and slaughter them there. These teenagers would wind up dead in reality, and we follow our protagonist, Nancy, played by Heather Langenkamp, as she plots a way to fight the scarred man from her dreams, who she believes is somehow behind the murder of her friends. Her troubled mother is hanging on to a dark secret, and Nancy's journey is an upward battle as she struggles to find anyone who believes her, resulting in Nancy having to face the monster alone.
Who are you?
Chances are that you're aware of the plot of A Nightmare on Elm Street, and more so acquainted with the antagonist, Freddy Krueger. Krueger was the caretaker of the local school and was set alight and killed by Nancy's mother and a lynch mob of parents, after the authorities couldn't find enough evidence to arrest him after he was revealed to be assaulting and murdering the children of Elm Street. Which raises the question, why on earth is Freddy Krueger such a beloved character? In the later installments of the franchise, they clearly have a lot more fun with the character, turning him into a one-liner delivering, shade-wearing arsehole of pop culture. And so society forgets he's a child murderer. Freddy has been dropping iconic lines since the first installment, but here they aren't for comic relief. Freddy is a sick, twisted, and strangely proud character in A Nightmare on Elm Street and seeks revenge against his killers as if he did nothing wrong and murdering children was totally justified. A true psychopath, Freddy Krueger should have been one of the most irredeemable pieces of trash in cinema history, but somehow became one of the most lovable and recognizable baddies in movie history. So why did Freddy stand out so much in 1984? The other slasher stars of the time, Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers, were strong silent types, towering over their victims with cold, expressionless masks on their faces. Opting to walk towards their prey, voiceless and empty, Jason and Michael are vessels for evil, powerful, almost supernatural monsters who never remain dead. And in all honesty, that's scary enough, but horror fans didn't know they needed someone like Freddy. One of the first slasher icons with an actual personality. He teased his victims for days, laughed at them, and chipped away at their hopes, resulting in a form of psychological fear that Jason and Michael rarely caused. Freddy is slim and crooked, but his melted skin and love of cutting himself in front of his victims made him just as intimidating as his contemporaries. The popularity and eventual evolution of Freddy is something that we will touch on further throughout this series.
Open the door!
A Nightmare on Elm Street was obviously made on the cheap and is hidden in shadow to help disguise this, but this helps in giving Nightmare its rememberable style, and the mixture of dark corners, misty scenery and peculiar soundtrack shrouds the movie in a very dreamy atmosphere, sometimes blurring the line of reality and the dream world for its protagonists, reinforcing the themes of the movie fairly well. The effects are inconsistent, but for such a low budget movie, there's a surprisingly big amount of effects on display here. Obviously, a lot of the effects don't stand up to today's standards, but I still think a lot of the early scenes have wonderful effects and amazingly creative death scenes, including the rotating room created for Tina's death, and obviously, the famous Johnny Depp bed scene. These scenes do seem to be dampened by the awful blow-up doll effect during the closing of the movie, a scene forced in there by producer Robert Shea to leave the movie open to a sequel, leaving this decent slasher flick on a sour note. To this day, I still think this is possibly the best Freddy has looked, simply because of how rough and realistic he looks here compared to how plastic and clean he looks in some of the later entries. I'd also argue that despite how iconic Freddy is, his design isn't very good, but possibly purposefully so. The Christmas sweater is possibly the worst thing ever worn by a slasher icon, and Leatherface wears actual people. Craven made the decision to cover Freddy in this jumper because he found research that suggested that those two shades of red and green are two of the hardest colours for the human eyes to see together, creating a jarring visual for moviegoers, which I respect in theory for a monster straight from your nightmares, but it's just too ugly to watch, so I guess it worked. The premise of A Nightmare on Elm Street was obviously gripping, and the idea of being killed in your sleep where you are defenseless and alone is fairly terrifying. Being hunted by a disfigured intruder in the one place you have no control over, and the one place you have absolutely no choice in going to, your dreams. There's a violation of personal space with the character of Freddy Krueger. You often meet him alone, defenseless, in your room at night, still wearing your pyjamas, and the power of this clearly resonated with audiences in 1984 when this feature launched a massive new slasher franchise for New Line Cinema. A Nightmare on Elm Street blew up at the box office, becoming the next horror sensation after Halloween and Friday the 13th. The audience loved the movie, and more so Freddy himself, thanks to Robert Englund's expressive performance and sinister charm, opening up the possibility for a sequel. Wes Craven always thought that adding a twist ending and leaving Nightmare open for a sequel would betray the feature, and so didn't return for the sequel. Next time, we dig deep into the intriguing story of Freddy's Revenge, the intentionally, or maybe unintentionally, gay slasher sequel.
I need you, Jesse. We got special work to do here, you and me.
Big thank you to everyone who stuck around with me there. This is my first go at editing a big video, putting something like this together for something like YouTube, and I appreciate any feedback that you might want to give in the comment section. People have managed to track down a lot of the newspaper articles from the earlier times that Wes Craven was inspired by. They'll be linked in the description because a lot of them actually really are a fascinating read, including, there's a lot of theory as to what actually is happening with the people who are dying in their sleep. A lot of people thought it might be from nerve gas, but obviously a lot of doctors try to disprove that. And it's a pretty interesting read. So they'll be linked in the description if you want to read those. And I feel like throughout this series, I feel like I might shit on Robert Shea quite a bit. He's the producer of A Nightmare on Elm Street, and he was the producer a long time for the series there. And I disagree with a lot of his financial decisions and business decisions with the character and the movie franchise as a whole. But to be fair, he was an instrumental part in making Nightmare a reality, put a lot of his own money and time into making the feature. So don't take anything I say too seriously there. He still did a lot of good for the franchise. So anyway, that's about it. Thanks for watching. You know, obviously the usual, leave a like if you enjoyed the video and all that kind of stuff. I do want to hear your feedback in the comments there. And I'll be back. I do hope to do more in the Nightmare on Elm Street series. Obviously, I think the sequel, Freddy's Revenge, is a fascinating one because there's so much controversy between the actual people who made the movie about whether it was supposed to be intentionally gay or not. And it's quite a fun one. Despite not being the greatest movie, I don't know. We'll get into it if people are still interested in seeing more from this series. So until then, thank you very much. I'll see you later.